Hey, everybody. It's the 81st week of this crazy train of webinars. And I am wearing my favorite and my only rugby jersey, not because I'm 59 and it was Guinness established in 1759. Think about that. That's pretty cool. And I'm not even a big Guinness fan, but I am a fan of brands that survive that long, 17 years or whatever before the founding of our country. So that's pretty cool. And hey, I guess there's some tussling going on, back and forth in Congress, especially between the Republicans and the Democrats. So I'm well represented in red, white, and blue. So anyway, we'll be talking about that. And it's always interesting with Adam and Jack. And Jack, I heard rumor that he's not in Washington, D.C., hiding out behind the podium. I think he's in another location. So we'll see where he's at today. Adam, and I also know, Mike, you sent us a note and we will deal with ERC. We got all kinds of stuff to talk about. Debt ceiling. What's that mean to you? We'll talk about PPP. We'll talk about ERC. We'll talk about whatever you guys want to talk about. Hit us up with the Q&A though, if you would, for the questions. You can harass us in the chat. It'll come, especially if Joe's on. So anyway, Adam, you want to do a little bit of your preamble and then we'll see wherever Jack is today?
Yeah, and if you could let me share my screen, that'd be awesome, Gary, and then I'll give you the host back.
All right, you are now the host.
All right, perfect. Yeah, so, a couple things. One is on North Carolina and the deductibility of PPP. Remember that both the House and the Senate, as part of their respective budget proposals, included some deductibility for the PPP expenses. House version was way more favorable than the Senate version. But I couldn't find anything that talked about what they've negotiated, but apparently the current status is now it's down to literally, Phil Berger and Tim Moore meeting directly because the respective Senate and House budget committees have worked through all the differences they can work through. Now it's their last mano a mano negotiations. Once they've negotiated, remembering that both these budgets passed with a veto approved majority, they're then going to loop in Cooper. So my only point in saying that is, while it will not probably be in time for October 15th when tax returns are due, I do feel pretty optimistic that we're going to see some movement on the PPP front that will hopefully get some of those taxes that we've had to have our clients pay in to North Carolina come back. So that's a welcome piece of good news. On the federal tax increase side, I think we've been talking, hopefully we'll know more in the next week or 2 weeks around whether or not there's going to be, tax rate increases effective 2022 or not based on the infrastructure bills. Jack's going to talk about that in his opening. But one of the things that I did want to bring up that's come up quite a bit is, capital gains tax. And we've had a lot of clients that said, well, should I hurry up and get something done? Meaning presumably sell. And, my take on that has been, look, in the House proposal, the effective date of a capital gains tax rate increase was September 13th, 2021. So if you hadn't already entered into a contract, there's no point in rushing now, to sell anything off because you already missed the window of opportunity. And, obviously this will go through reconciliation process. Maybe that will change, but I don't see any rush to sell anything until you see whether or not something passes, because, your window of opportunity for September 13th already passed, one. And then second, if the House passes something, goes to the Senate and it reconciles, we'll know a lot more around what they're going to do about that September 13th date, if anything. But last time I checked, that's not something that Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema are all bothered about, is September 13th date. It's the level of spending, not, the tax differences themselves, because the tax differences that the House has proposed and the Senate voted on are largely what Joe Manchin has been aligned with. It's his capital gains rate, it's his corporate tax rate, it's his, income tax rates. It's more the spending side that he's got a problem with. So with that in mind, what I did want to share, because Gary and I like to argue a lot, and I like to remind him of the facts. It is that, this is a graph of the federal deficit. I mean, if you went back in time to Eisenhower, it wouldn't look radically different. It's just the dollar values would change a lot. But, honestly, when you're talking about the federal deficit, that's the amount of money that the federal government spends, including having to pay its debt, relative to the amount of tax revenues that it brings in. So, every year that we have a deficit, we keep on adding to, the amount that we're in excess. So when they talk about raising the federal debt limit, they've had it on the news, some people are listening to it, other people aren't. It just would behoove us to talk about, well, what are they really talking about? That's really saying, for all these orange, dark orange bars, which is deficit spending, which we clearly see have been going on since President Bush. So he was bad. These were tax cuts, unpaid for wars, and a prescription drug benefit that was not paid for. That's Bush. Then he rolls into the Great Recession. That's Obama. Then some Obamacare coming through here. And then we got Trump. And these didn't rein in any spending and did a tax cut and then a pandemic. So when they're talking about raising the federal debt limit, that isn't for, extrapolating out for this $3.5 trillion bill. I mean, you'd have to raise that debt limit in the future year. This is all about paying for this crap that's already been incurred under 3 administrations, 2 Republican, 1 Democrat. So I just think, generally when people get all kind of hot and bothered about, just remember that pretty much no administration, no Congress since Clinton and Gingrich, I can't believe we're all wishing we had them back, but since Clinton and Gingrich were able to actually produce a budget surplus. Everybody since then has spent like a drunken freaking sailor in Bangkok. So it's pretty much been equal opportunity offenses. So all this kind of, oh my gosh, it's that side, y'all need to, it's both you suck. So, kind of the difference is now is that, this pandemic spending was unfunded, the tax cut was unfunded. Now they're just talking about raising taxes to at least fund and not make this much worse than it already is the point of the tax. So they want to spend money like drunken sailors, but they're also talking about raising taxes to cover the money that they want to spend like drunken sailors. So it's like, whether you agree with social spending or not, which is part of the $3.5 trillion proposal, the tax rate increase is to at least, not make this deficit thing worse than it already is. So, and then I'm not bringing up the graph, but on the whole economic argument about tax cuts stimulate the economy, that's not correct. I mean, the only time that's actually occurred in recent history was under Reagan, but that's when the top marginal rate was 70%. And it was a very temporary blip. Outside of that, there is no correlation between a tax rate decrease and the economy going up to subsequently pay for it. Those have moved independent of each other. The only thing that there's a correlation to is tax rate decrease, economy stays the same because tax rate decreases don't work to stimulate the economy. Tax rate decrease, unfunded and not paid for, don't want to cut any spending, deficit goes up. Oh, I know what we'll do instead. we'll spend a lot of money on social programs, because those people, once we spend money on social programs, they'll start spending that money and that'll boost the economy. Guess what? That doesn't work either. So it's all, the libertarian says it's all bad. So just be honest and say it's all bad. Anyway, I'll shut up with that and turn it over to Jack for a positive.
Well, it's a good thing I'm wearing a Guinness rugby shirt, because there's a lot of references to drunken sailor spending.
Yeah, so that could be a solution, that instead of dealing with our problems, we'll just go drink and hopefully forget about them.
No, we don't need to do that. All right, Jack, where the heck are you?
All right. So before the big reveal, a little bit of explanation. So, we've been talking about things like obviously the money, infrastructure, stimulus bills, about people getting involuntarily shot up, and the problems that employers face and those kind of things. But, and we talk about, and we kind of tend to forget kind of the more personal and impact of COVID in relation to us as neighbors, to each other's as humans, and kind of just, we kind of lose our minds sometimes. So decided to go into a different venue and share with you an important story that I think we need to keep in mind. And so I'm coming to, and before I do the big reveal, whoever's fastest on the chat line gets a $10 certificate. That has to tell me where I am. All right. And so here it goes. 3, 2, 1, 1.5, quarter. Oh wait, no pre-guessing. All right, here we go. That's where I am. All right, so I'm going to read you this story. It's very
Where's your
important.
sweater?
Hanging up on my door behind.
Okay.
Yeah, you can't see it. It's off screen.
Yeah.
Offset.
Lisa was fastest on the draw.
Oh, okay. All right. So here's the story. This is from Edison, New Jersey. Tony Cesaro, the bingo director at St. Helena Church, unlocked the door to the parish hall from inside. It was 2 hours before the night's first game, but already 62 players were standing in the parking lot. The jackpot was high at a little over $4,000. Players had been unruly of late. To restore order, Mr. Cesaro set up a rope line and mandated that they pre-order packages of game tickets via text message. Now, 106 gamblers were on the reservation list. As he read off the first 12 names, 20 players surged forward past others, some who leaned on canes for balance. The pandemic forced many churches to close for more than a year. In some spots, security guards and Good Samaritans struggled to keep the peace at the door. Patience, said Nell Valentine, 63, as she watched a middle-aged woman hold her elderly mother's hand so as to not lose her to the rush of players. Okay. There are people that are losing their minds. And so I'm just saying that, okay, a little bit of patience, a little bit of love, a little bit of grace will go a long way, not just only in the bingo lines, but, supermarkets and everything else. So I know that we're all getting kind of frustrated and like, okay, wearing a mask, not wearing a mask, forgetting to wear a mask and having to go back to the car to get the mask. I mean, all those things, right? So, all right. On a more serious note, so I'm going to read you some sound bites of things, starting with the president yesterday said, we've got 3 things to do: the debt ceiling, the continuing resolution, and 2 pieces of legislation. I would argue that those are 4. You can't really just put the 2 pieces of legislation together and say, oh, it's just one thing. It's really 2 things, right? So here's some more. Here's this quote. The reconciliation bill is designed to be a deficit. You're going to love this one, Adam. Is designed to be a deficit and debt neutral. In other words, the tax increases. It gets better. The tax increases cover the cost of the programs and targeted tax cuts without adding to the national debt. Senate and House moderates want the bottom line trimmed significantly. So they're basically saying, well, it's supposed to be it's supposed to be neutral, but we would rather it be reduced, right? So there's that. I do want to, before going out into a little bit into the what's going on in Capitol Hill, is to make sure that people understand the differences between the continuing resolution and the debt ceiling issue. So the 2 things: funding the federal government's operations and raising the federal debt ceiling. So As far as the funding the government, so basically it's a line of credit, and it's how the government pays its employees and really functions and everything else. So these appropriations expire at midnight tonight. And so if the statement is new appropriations are not signed into law by that time, the government will shut down and federal employees may once again face furloughs. And the debt ceiling is related to the amount of debt the U.S. government is legally allowed to carry, and that expires in mid-October. And so the failure to increase the debt ceiling would lead to default, a potential economic recession, and additional furloughs. So I want to make sure that, some people have asked me, well, it just kind of sounds all the same. Is it a matter of just kind of moving the ball and printing more money and, all kinds of things? So not necessarily. So let's get kind of the core things. So statement by Speaker Pelosi that she wants to pass the bill today, but she left wiggle room to delay the vote. The legislation, which passed the Senate last month, is opposed by scores of progressive Democrat lawmakers who say they want to progress on legislation to bolster the social safety net, which is the bigger one, the $3.5 trillion versus the $1 trillion infrastructure bill. And so what you have is, and if you were listening to NPR this morning, it is one person that is holding, on the Democratic side, that is holding all this up, which is obviously not true, but they're Joe Manchin and his counterpart, Kristen Sinema of Arizona. And they call it the Manchin Cinema issue. So as of, this is a report of 4:30 this morning. I don't know where things are at. I haven't had a chance to check before we got on this morning, but they support, or they oppose it. But they haven't said, well, what's the number? Everybody keeps asking them, the president, everybody, the senators are asking, okay, what's your number? What's your counter proposal? What do you want to trim, et cetera? And it's just not happening. The part of the infighting is that you have senators who say that we are not going to push this $1 trillion bill through until we get the $3.5 trillion bill further along and potentially close to being final. You remember 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, when all this came up, it's like, okay, September 29th, September 30th, are they really going to be able to do it? And there were promises made, all kinds of promises. And so, and then there are others who said, we never said that. We never agreed to that. It was all, it was to be that we make progress on two parallel tracks, and at the same time, rather than going in serial, we're going in parallel. And so that's really what the main issue is that, okay, people are trying to keep them tethered together when, and it's stalling out everything. So that's why you hear about, well, why is this being held up? Who is doing it? Can't they just do it in baby steps? Well, there's people who want to do it in baby steps, if you consider spending trillions of dollars baby steps, but 1 trillion versus 3.5 trillion. So that's really kind of what's going on in the background. And as I said, I just wanted to give you a little bit of that so you understand, kind of get the Cliff Notes version of the what's been going on. And if anybody knows if something significant has happened in the past hour or two, please share that on the chat. But I'm not aware of that, but I admittedly have not been looking in the past 2 hours.
You mean you've actually been doing paid work?
Yeah,
No,
I do that on occasion.
Oh man. Well, hit us up with questions, y'all. And the chat has been interesting today. Joe, you kind of win the most creative chat so far. I feel like I've turned into another episode of Jeopardy, only unlike Amadio, who has won for 31 days in a row. We are the losers. You're not the loser. You're on here. So anyway, here's a question from Mike, though, going back to ERC. So kind of go back in your memory banks here. Question is the same question I asked in late August. What's going on with ERC for Q4? Is it ending tomorrow or at the end of the year, or is it still up in the air? If it's still up in the air, what does Adam think will happen and when?
Yeah. So good question. So two things. First off, to address Jack's comment, anything new? It looks like keeping the government open, which is just the shutdown piece, that looks like it's going to pass today. That just announcement that Republicans and Democrats in the Senate both agreed that they would do that. But to Mike's question around the employee retention tax credit, so the Senate infrastructure bill, which was the small infrastructure bill at a paltry $1 trillion, but for real infrastructure, not human infrastructure, that included a provision that accelerated the end of the employer retention tax credit to September 30th of this year. So my own feeling on it is that today is September 30th. It still hadn't passed the House. Law of the land is that baby goes to the end of the year. So I'm going to say that I see that just being negotiated out is my own feeling. That if the infrastructure bill passes, it's still got to go to, some form of reconciliation. I don't see him going retroactive on it. So could they say, look, it stops effective, whatever date, we actually pass the legislation? Maybe, but unless something passes today, I really feel like, look, it's going to stick with the law of the land, and the law of the land was through the end of the year. So, the more time that expires, the more time's on your side. So like if I was betting, which my kid's kind of a gambler, if I was betting, I give it better. I wouldn't say, look, I'm going to stake my life on this outcome, but I give it better than 50-50 that it's going to be in place through the end of the year. Because that's not enough money that's worth dying on the hill for.
A couple questions that have come in. One from Bruce: any idea as to whether North Carolina 2-year budget will be approved or vetoed by the governor? There are implications on education, broadband, and state tax implications. What I'd said at the opening of the webinar is that in theory, it doesn't matter if he does veto it, because it was passed with the original drafts that got reconciled between the House and Senate were passed with the veto-proof majority. So, and they all included some spending increases. So, if you're Cooper and you're going to veto, what are you going to veto it for? Because there's probably some, unfunding of something that you really liked, or alternatively, it didn't spend enough. But even then, in theory, it passed with veto-proof majorities. So it shouldn't matter, if he vetoes it or not. All right. Another question here is, when should we expect to receive 2020 employee tax credit we applied for over 3 months ago? The earliest that we'd seen was about 5 months. So, hopefully you've not been holding your breath this long, but I did hear that the free diving champion did hold his breath for 9 minutes. 5 months would be a long time, but I think if the earliest that we've seen is 5 months, then you could probably peg it at probably 5 to 7 months. Yeah, that's what we've been hearing from ERC today. So here's a question. What do you do if the Democrats axe the backdoor Roth individual retirement account strategy? Any thoughts? Well, if they axe the Roth backdoor, so what the Roth backdoor strategy is that, when you get above a certain income level, contributing to a traditional Roth IRA isn't a tax deduction. So like if I contribute, $1,000 into a Roth IRA, but my AGI is too high, I don't get a tax deduction for that.
But I can still be in the Roth, which means the earnings are going to grow tax-free. Well, what you have the ability to do is to convert, regardless of income level currently, those Roth IRAs, those IRAs into Roth IRAs, which means now you already had some post-tax money because you didn't get a deduction in the first place. You're allowed to convert it into a Roth so you can take advantage of all the provisions of the Roth IRA because there's no income limitation on it. So, it is a good strategy of getting some pre-tax gains to convert to post-tax gains for real people with really high incomes without really having a tax consequence. And the Senate is, or the legislation that's been proposed is said, hey, we're not going to allow people to do that anymore. So my thought on that is, again, not retroactive. So I would consider employing that as a year-end strategy potentially.
Jack, Mr. Rogers is nodding his head.
Yeah.
Any question?
I have nothing to add.
Mr. Rogers, man, we could use some more Mr. Rogers. I mean, even as a kid, though, he was kind of cringeworthy for me. I mean, like, I don't know. His puppets kind of freaked me out. So here's an interesting question, and this is not a political question at all. All right. So, but this really is probably more a Jack question. So across, like, I think it was on MSN that hit me today with an article that the state of New York is basically saying, I from what I remember, it was like 70,000 unvaccinated healthcare workers that were refusing to be vaccinated for one reason or the other. If they quit or they were fired, they were going to be denied unemployment insurance. Is that legal?
So can I say maybe and punt on? No.
Oh, that would be such a Jack move.
Of course. Yeah. Of course, it's part of my profession. So the reality is, and so it's not just in New York, it is in other places. I mean, it's here locally. I think Novant said, hey, don't come to work. And there's other places. And I have had some of my partners in the other offices in our labor and actually some guys here too, that have gone on the record on local news channels that said, hey, look, at this point, private employers, as long as it's not discriminatory, and then even going as far as saying that there are some governing bodies of different religions in the US that have said that, we're not taking a religious stance, meaning we're not objecting on religious grounds for this. To get the shot. And so what you have is that with your particular question is, all right, so you're entitled to unemployment in most cases if you are involuntarily removed without cause, essentially. So you're basically, hey, sorry, we don't need your help anymore. So if, and most people who are terminated will take a shot at getting their unemployment, and then newer employers or who don't have experience will come to us and say, hey, we got this, what do we do with it? But then you very easily get trained to say, okay, I know how to respond. Yes, this person was terminated on this date for cause, and therefore is not entitled to unemployment, et cetera. And so what they're saying is this is termination for, essentially reading between the lines, is termination for cause. And so therefore you're not entitled to these benefits. And so don't go looking for them. Again, another point of litigation. Although in this instance, it may be that the regulators will swoop in and say, this is our interpretation of a termination for not being vaccinated and being asked to not come to the workplace, that it is for cause or it's not for cause, and so they would be subject to unemployment. But the default at this point, which makes sense just because it's, that they're saying that the reason you can't come to work is because you have violated our policy. We have a policy, we put it in place, you've decided to not comply with that policy, so therefore it's a termination for cause. So that's how that all kind of comes together and ultimately results in a denial of that benefit.
So here's another one that came across actually early this week, and they may be a referral that I make to you, Jack, but they're trying to go without lawyers at this point. But here's the scenario. I know. I'm like, man, I don't know that I would fight this one. But I don't know. I'd go to Jack's firm. But here's the deal. So this is they do post-tension concrete for multifamily home builders, right? So for large general contractors, they were told, and they've got, kind of a mix of people that have chosen the vaccine, some that have not, and they're trying to just, like everybody, trying to straddle the line, and like they care about their people and that sort of thing. And they're also trying to honor personal decisions or whatever. Well, they got this multi-million-dollar contract, and then they signed the contract, and then afterwards, the general contractor that had hired him, and again, these guys are all working outside. They are, taking mud and turning it into concrete, so they're outside. The general contractor basically said, in following the CDC's recommendation, not a mandate, but a recommendation, we're asking and we're mandating basically that all our subcontractors be on job sites fully vaccinated, and we're demanding that you basically ensure that all your people, well, all of their people, not all of them are their own employees. They've got a bunch of contractors and subs as well. And they're like, well, so now we've got the onus to go chase down a bunch of people that are outside of our control. I mean, there's like, it's this dicey either way you go. What do you do in that kind of a situation?
Yeah, it's funny because it's you, Adam, there's a little bit of back feed on your mic.
I'm going to mute him.
Okay. And so as soon as you started, a few 30 seconds into your explanation, I knew exactly where you're going with this, because I've seen it on landlord-tenant issues, subtenancies. I've seen it in the construction industry, the service industry, equipment, distribution industry. So, for example, reviewing a contract and it's in there. And so keep in mind that many contracts, it's kind of like choose your adventure. And what they'll do is they will embed links to additional terms and conditions of the contract. And they'll have language in there that says, and you agree that you will comply with any modifications to the terms and conditions after you sign this document. And then it will say that you are then responsible for knowing the changes for terms and conditions. So we're not going to tell you, you get to go maybe every 6 months or so and go find those things, and they're immediately binding. So you can see I have all these layers. And so when I get something like that, I'm peeling away the layers, which is that you have to expressly tell us it can't be implemented in less than 30 days or whatever the appropriate time period is. And it allows us, if we don't want to comply with it, to terminate the contract because they are not going to allow you to dictate the terms and conditions. If they have the leverage, they're not going to allow you to dictate the terms and conditions now or later. And it's come up a lot in the context of safety protocols for COVID. And as you said, the control of, well, certainly there is an expectation you're going to be able to control your own employees, that you get to choose the independent contractors that you use as subcontractors if you're the subcontractor, so the subs. But once you start getting further away from being able to validate and verify their status, but it ultimately comes down to the responsibility of the contracting party. And if you agree that you will abide by those terms and conditions, which may be changed in their sole discretion, and they change it to, you need to do this, then I think that's more of a problem to do it after the fact, but it's not that it is impermissible. I think that you get into, is it done in good faith? Is it done as a way to create an issue, an issue for cause to terminate that contract? And so what I've been doing is on the front end is making sure that the people who are going to sign on the dotted line of that contract for my client have gone through those terms and conditions, or they say, Jack, we need you to. And I'm like, okay, if it's like a federal contract, I'm like, I don't think you want me to be doing that, because you will probably pay me more than the value of that contract in some cases. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but so those are the things you need to be aware of, is, really read the terms of the contract, look for those rabbit holes that they say, click here, any other terms and conditions applicable to this contract appear at this website, and you hereby agree to whatever's on that website. So that's where people get the most in trouble. Like I said, it's you build in the safeguards to provide notice and the opportunity to stay in or get out, which is easier said than done, meaning that, when you're nose deep in the middle of a project, a construction project, is it going to be, is it really going to be economically feasible for you to get out? And then what do you do? Maybe there's been scenarios where, as you might imagine, that the writing says what it says, but then everybody's turning a blind eye. It's like, yeah, okay, until something happens. And then when something happens, everybody goes to the documents and they say, we told you had to do this. You didn't do it. Therefore, you're responsible. But we haven't been wearing masks for 3 months. I don't care. Now, there is a tenet of equitable law that would say that possibly the behavior has modified the contract so that becomes essentially an amendment. But then you have language in the contract that usually says that no amendments are effective unless they're in writing and signed by all of the parties that it impacts. So course of performance, course of dealing can modify contracts in some instances, but those are all very difficult and expensive roads to go down to litigate. So you just need to be on notice and aware of your surroundings, meaning what's in the agreement and what you're agreeing to, not just now, but in the future.
Yeah. Bottom line is, if there's, their take was, hey, this was not in the agreement. We signed an agreement. Now we're ready to start pouring, and we got a new modification. But to your point, there may be some gotcha language in the original contract that they're not aware of. And if that's the case, what are you going to do? So
it can be a challenge also, Gary, that if you're provided a written contract with a hyperlink in it, it's like, okay, how are you going to get to that? And then even in electronic contracts, the hyperlink is there, but it's white noise. It's like, okay, well, standard terms and conditions. It's like, if you pay late, we're going to charge interest. Well, no, there's a lot more to that, and insurance, indemnification, things. And when it's a master contract situation, where that's the master contract, and you have all these SOW, statements of work, or and other things, all those terms apply to those conditions down the road, or to the performance of the work. So it can be pretty extensive and permeate through the services or the goods that you're providing under this master contract. So it can have significant additive or cumulative impact on your work, your cash flow, and everything else. If, especially, I mean, it's in most contracts will allow you to suspend your performance for the other side's breach in most cases. So, hey, I'm not going to pay you until you start doing this stuff, you know? And so then it's like, well, and maybe it's as easy as getting a box of masks and throwing them out and saying, wear these, but you know, usually it's not that easy. So anyway.
Yeah, in this case, it was forced vaccinations, you know, which, I mean, that's dicey, and it's, you know, emotionally charged in a lot of ways. So interesting. I remember my first business mentor a long time ago said, Gary, you work really hard to win the business, then you work really hard to get the business done, and then you work really hard to get paid for what you did. And now we're adding even more layers now. I mean, he's 90 some, still kicking, but I don't think he's in business anymore. But man, it seems like the hurdles just keep getting higher. All right, question here from David. The labor pool is already strained in construction industry. From my experience, blue collar workers are less likely to be vaccinated. Yeah, and that's what one of their concerns was. If Novant and Atrium really go through and require all workers to be vaccinated, they'll most likely be doubling the amount of time for construction projects to be completed. Yeah, interesting. I mean, these are strange times.
And that's a very interesting observation and accurate. And I would say if you were, if you made that statement to an anti-vaxxer, or, I mean, there's two sides. It's like, okay, well, if we force people to get vaccinations and we don't put or the alternative or the consequences, you don't work, then yes, that obviously impacts our labor force. The flip side of that is, okay, well, let's just have a free for all and everybody shows up and then people get sick and then people are at home, not sitting on their couches because they want to, but because they have to, because they're not vaccinated and they got other people sick. So I'm not going to take a position either way. I mean, it's, you know, we're vaccinated and we made that choice, but we also took into account, and I think I even said here on this program a couple of weeks ago, you know, apologize to my kids that, you know, well, this is the best that we could do for you as parents at this point, making this decision, and hopefully it doesn't impact you 30, 40 years down the road, when, you know, we're gone. So.
Right. Wisdom is required. Good comments, good questions. Anything else? Have you seen any late breaking news? Do we have anything before midnight? No, Adam's been monitoring. But, you know, Mr. Rogers' stoplight is not either red or yellow or green. I mean,
Yeah,
given today, it would be probably yellow going towards the red.
yeah, they said if I plugged in too much stuff, it's going to blow the fuse. So I didn't plug in the light, that
there you go.
Yeah, yeah. But I do have a good dad joke, and this is a good one.
Oh my goodness. It wouldn't be one of our webinars without one of those gems.
It's been a while. I've been saving up. I saw this is from Saturday, right? On my calendar. All right. What do you call Darth Vader when he's nervous? I'm already laughing.
That's great when you're laughing at your own joke and you know the punchline. All right, hit it.
Panic in Skywalker. Oh, come on. That's hilarious.
Oh,
Panic in
man,
Skywalker.
I don't know. We're going to have to start doing some polls. Lisa goes, no.
All right, Lisa, now I'm not
hilarious.
sending you that certificate now. You just revoked it.
Do you happen to have Lisa's email, by the way?
Probably, but go ahead, and Lisa, if you don't mind sending it to me or to Gary, and then he'll send it to me, and then I'll get you.
Fine.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, here's another question. David, thanks for weighing in on this. along the same line, what happens if they enforce the vaccination requirement on construction workers and there's a timeline for work to be completed in the contract? Would the work completion timeline still be enforceable? Ooh, that's a good question.
That is an awesome question, because now you're getting into if it's a contract that was entered into recently, whoever drafted it, if they were being mindful, there is a pandemic and epidemic provision in the force majeure. And so any prevention, suspension of performance that is caused by a force majeure event, which can now be linked back to the pandemic epidemic, that I would say, okay, creative argument is that it's does that excuse performance because of that, because we can't get it done on a timely basis, so therefore it's not a breach. So in not that I was I don't know, with significant foresight, it's just that in force majeure clauses, you should of good course have an outside limit to that, and depending on what it is in what industry, et cetera. So if it's a lease, and then or whatever, construction or anything else, that you have a maximum amount of time. The reality is, if that contracting party can't perform, what are the possibilities that other contracting parties can perform that same work? So, or is it really kind of individualized to that particular company that can't perform? So you have to go and cover yourself in order to proceed forward. And so you get into those situations, but I think that it has created a creative way of not being in breach because of the pandemic. But as far as I know, that something like that has not been litigated, because we're really kind of new at putting that stuff into these contracts to be very explicit that that's a force majeure event. And in some cases, you're very specific as to what happens in the force majeure events. So if it's something that has a material impact on the contract, or cannot be unreasonably circumvented or dealt with. So for example, you can't hire other people as substitutes, or you can't get that component elsewhere. I mean, so a good example is if I doubt that many of you are buying new cars these days. They're being built, they're being stored in groups of hundreds, but they're missing a little chip about this big that goes in the car that is part of the brain of the car, because they can't be produced. So, as much as I might want a new car, and there's no way I'm going to pay the price for it, I'm going to wait until and I shouldn't say this, I represent car dealerships, so don't tell them, but I'm going to wait until the market is flooded, because the prices will come down once they start putting those chips in the cars and when they're manufactured. And there's some companies that have opened up production facilities specifically for those chips, including domestic and foreign manufacturers, the manufacturers of the cars themselves, not the goods providers that have traditionally been manufacturing that. So it's kind of like survival to set up your own shop to be able to produce your own chips to put in your own cars, kind of thing. So that's a long-winded way of saying that, yes, that potentially is a force majeure event.
That's good. And David says, hey, I'm not trying to take a stance on the vaccine. No, we get it, man. I mean, it's like those were really good questions. I'm sure you are not the only one wondering about them.
I know, not to play the other side of the argument, but pre-pandemic, same conversation. I can't find people that can pass a drug test. And if a contract had in a clause, your folks got to be clean, that it's kind of, I understand it, like from the end user's point of view, I could see them thinking it's not really any different. I mean, you got people on site, my people are at risk, blah, 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 blah. So I don't know. I kind of look at it as the first place that I think we've really seen this show up in force is on Department of Defense contracts. And if you're doing work there at a military base or VA hospital or whatever, this is starting to show up.
Yeah, another interesting place where it shows up is in drafting leases moving forward, which is for two reasons. One is construction. If there is, like in the franchise world, so the franchisor has expectations and requirements in the franchise agreement that you will be up and running after a certain period of time. So in the franchise agreements, you build in essentially a force majeure clause specifically related to the construction and opening and operation of the business. And then also lease related is when you have variable rent to be paid, and it's based on a certain model. And I have not seen as many of those because clients are not willing to get into those. They want a fixed rent. And so, but the ones that are variable rent that are, part of gross sales, because that's just the way it is that even though maybe the base rent is lower just because of the pandemic. And so the variable rate, there's even negotiation discussion on the variable rate to a point where that if you model and you pro forma what you think the performance is, and then it drops below a certain amount, then that excuses payment of the variable rent component for whatever period of time it is. And there's various interesting creative ways to construct something like that. But it's basically because what if people, for example, a restaurant, decide that they're not going to come in and eat anymore. I think that was more of a problem in last year, but I think a lot of businesses have pivoted to be able to deal with that, including upping their game on their apps so that you don't really have to minimal contact with. You order, you put your credit card in, and magically your food comes out at some point in the designated parking spot that you put into the app, and things like that. So, but it does have an impact and gives you the ability with a little more leverage on pricing, essentially, whether it's a lease or otherwise, in other terms, in kind of the spirit of force majeure, that there is something external that is going to impact your performance of your business. Now, keep in mind that the force majeure concept is a construct of trying to address the unknown. So it's kind of, a little bit conflicting or inconsistent to say that what we don't know is the impact necessarily of the results, but we know that it's here and we know that there's going to be a problem. So if I'm on the end of trying to enforce something and saying this is not a force majeure event, I'm going to have to focus on what the impact of it is, not the event or occurrence of it, to say, well, we're in an pandemic, so there must be an impact. It's like, well, no, what were the economic consequences of that, and was that unknown? Or are we at a point where Delta variant has gotten us by the hold, gotten a hold of us, so you can't use the Delta variant as a force majeure event because you knew it was there, and then therefore you should be negotiating those lease terms for reduction in variable rent, extended period of time to construct the business so that the franchisor doesn't hold you in default, and those kind of things. So we know more than we did before, and as a contracting party, you're going to be held accountable for that, and not being able to use that as an excuse for performance or payment.
Well, Amazon has made out really well during this period of time. And I think it's clear that the demand for attorneys is going up. And unfortunately, with the North Carolina dragging their heels, the good news is it looks like they are going to allow those PPP expenses to be deducted. The bad news is if you're a client, or whether it be us or anybody else, and you've had to file already, you're going to have to file amendments, which will cost some money, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to what you're going to get back. So anyway, also we had almost 60 people on a really interesting panel yesterday. We were going to do it in person. We made the call about a month ago to go virtually. So we had about 60 people, which we wouldn't have been able to. 40 is really a nice size for us in our community room. But we had a 4-person panel, different industries represented, on the title of the Great Resignation, which hopefully you're not experiencing, but just the whole idea of hiring, retaining, and re-engaging employees in the middle of this. Really good. It's up on the YouTube, on the BGW CPA YouTube channel. Really very interesting discussion and things that apply to everybody that is employing anybody. So I encourage you to go see that. Last call for questions. You will miss my ugly face next week. I'm going to be with some friends that I haven't seen for a long time. And so I am taking some days off to see some old acquaintances. And I say old. So anyway, I'll miss you guys, but
do you remind Adam where the record button is?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Fortunately, we're on autopilot. As soon as we go live, it's recording, which is great. If anybody came in late on this, we will put it up on the BGW CPA YouTube channel later on today. Thanks for all the fun chat and for the great questions. Really, really good. Everybody behaved themselves really well. That's great. We appreciate that.
Be nice at bingo.
Be nice at bingo. Be more like Mr. Rogers, without the sweater, I guess. I don't know. Sweater's optional. So, Adam, anything last before we sign off?
No, just, nothing different from the opening tirade, which is, I don't know. I'm not good with hypocrisy. The level of hypocrisy on all sides of any discussion around, taxing, spending, social programs is just hogwash. So,
yeah. So the one thing that we can do about that is just be honest ourselves.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a need for that.
Right. Right.
That's right. I mean, be more like Mr. Rogers, So anyway, I haven't seen that documentary or that movie on him. Have you, Jack?
I haven't even seen the Tom Hanks remake of it. I haven't seen that either. So yeah.
My mom saw it and said it was really good. So anyway, I guess I'll have to do that. Now that you've been there, I don't know where you're going to be next week, but I'll be looking for it on the BGW CPA YouTube channel when I get back. All right, we're going to go ahead and sign off. Everybody, thank you for joining us. Thanks for your questions. And again, if let's see, Lisa, if you don't happen to have my email address, it's gfrey@trustbgw.com, and I will forward your contact information to Jack so that he can make good on your lickety split answer on knowing exactly where he was. So it's good stuff. Y'all have a great day. See you later.
Thank you. Bye.